So I'm going to start by transitioning into talking about HyFlex learning, and then Martha's going to talk about modular design. The reason we chose HyFlex and modular is not because we think that you should do HyFlex or modular learning for fall. The reason we chose these two is that learning about them gives you lots of options for how to design, and you can choose pieces of those options in order to work on your classes as you're designing for fall. So this is not about a shopping cart where you're either going to pick modular or you're going to pick HyFlex and go full force. This is just stuff to put in your toolbox. So we're going to start with HyFlex. And before I talk about what that is, I'm putting up this graph or chart here to just remind you of some of the words that we're more familiar with already, right? Face-to-face learning, blended learning, which it means face-to-face learning where you're using lots of connective technologies in, for example, your homeworks or how you communicate with students. Hybrid learning, where you may meet sometimes face-to-face and sometimes online. So if you had, say, a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, maybe your Fridays are online or half your seat time is online. And then, of course, fully online classes. And I would say a good chunk of us in USNH have taught across these different modalities a little bit. Some of us, because we're primarily residential campuses, have never taught fully online classes, and that really feels like a heavy lift. So what is HyFlex? Well, first, let me draw your attention to this quote that I read in WMUR, and I was like, oh, well, good, let me write that down because looks like I need to know something. The headline was, New Hampshire colleges plan for students to return to campus in the fall. And here's our chancellor saying, you know, we will do this if it's safe. And then this really interesting other statement. Anyone who does not feel safe will have the opportunity to continue all of their studies online. And I was just like, oh, make a note of that. And then, of course, all you folks started tweeting at me, does that mean faculty too? I don't know, friends. I don't know anything. All I know is that what it does seem to imply is that one thing that could happen is that the college opens for face-to-face learning, but some students choose to stay home. And that's not online learning, and that's not face-to-face learning. So what the heck is that, right? So there is a name for that kind of modality, which is HyFlex. This term was coined, I think, in 2013, and from 2013 until now, nobody has talked about it because it's a really, in some ways, challenging modality. We call these modalities, right? Online, face-to-face, hybrid. So this is a really challenging modality, and it was really a kind of a small segment of instructional designers and faculty who are interested in it. What happens now if you Google HyFlex is you're going to see lots of current articles being written because people realize this is a potentially interesting thing to know about given COVID-19. So HyFlex is a course design that presents components of hybrid learning in a flexible course structure that gives students the option of attending in the classroom, participating online, or doing both. They can change their mode of attendance weekly or by topic according to their need or preference. Instructors provide course content for both participation modes, online and face-to-face, and can tailor activities for each. So this is different than those kind of SNU-based, self-paced online modules, right? You're still all together as a class, progressing as a class, working as a class, but some people are online, synchronous, some people are online asynchronous, and some people are in the classroom. Wow.
Wait, hold on. I have to interrupt. Are you seriously asking us to design every course we are teaching in the fall so that they're online and fully face-to-face? I mean, what? I have 4 preps. What planet are you from?
Simmer down, Professor X. Let's address your concerns. So Professor X raises a very interesting comment about the challenge of designing a HyFlex course, because what you're hearing there in some ways is not even that it's 2 courses in one, but that it's 3 courses in one, because it's face-to-face, it's asynchronous online, and it's synchronous online. So synchronous online means they're joining you when you're teaching the face-to-face class, and you're sitting there teaching and their classroom is Zooming you. And that's what Anne was talking about earlier when she said Plymouth State has invested in outfitting these quote unquote Zoom rooms, right? So that you'll be able to teach without worrying too much about it, and Zoom is gonna pick it all up and transmit it out to your synchronous students. But the HyFlex model also asks you to design that same course for async students who are part of that same community. This is what I would call, in its technical terms, a hell of a lot of work. So one thing I think we want to do as we're thinking about HyFlex is to think about the impracticality of taking, for example, 3 preps and converting them all to A+ HyFlex courses for fall, especially if you think that's the only time you're ever going to use it in a HyFlex model, right? But some of what we learn about HyFlex is pretty cool and interesting. You may want to try this with 1 class. You may actually think some of this is helpful to you after COVID-19. In interdisciplinary studies, we're actually thinking some of this is useful to us without this pandemic. So let's not think about everybody's taking all of our courses full on HyFlex. Let's think about what parts of this design strategy we can use that work with our disciplines and our needs. So let's take a look. And after we talk about HyFlex, we're gonna have a Q&A moment in case anything's confusing. This guy, Beatty, his first name is Warren, not Warren, but I can't remember his actual first name. So let's call him Warren Beatty. This is recorded and it'll probably be shared on Twitter, and I actually know this guy. So I'm sorry, Professor Beatty. But he in 2013 was the guys at San Francisco State, and he's got some great materials out there that we're going to share to you, including some longer webinars about HyFlex design. But he talks about 4 values behind HyFlex, and I looked at these and I was like, dude, these are cool values. This is not like get everything online because you're going to get market share, which is like not, I think, like a motivating pedagogy for me, market share. But some of these are pretty interesting. So first of all, we've talked a lot with cluster learning, those of you who are in the cluster pedagogy learning community in particular, about what Kathy and some of the PBL folks call student voice and choice. How can we maximize student agency and ownership in the learning process? So what HyFlex does is it takes modality and makes that a learner choice. So learners get to decide how they learn best and what's going to serve their life circumstances best. And that's a value that is pretty interesting and intriguing for me. What happens if we let learners not just choose certain assignments in the class, say, but really choose how they engage in the class? Equivalency, which the idea here is that you've got these 3 different kinds of participants: online sync, online async, and face-to-face. You want to design so that your learning outcomes are all equivalent across those different cohorts. What that means is that you may have to do more backwards design than you're used to doing in your class. If your class tends, like mine, tend to be a little more emergent, which means those outcomes in some ways emerge from the work that the students do, now we have to be a little bit more sure that they're all going to align at the end. Some of you teach this way already with backwards design of learning outcomes, but if you don't, you would probably have to be more intentional about that with HyFlex. Reusability. We want to take artifacts from learning activities. So if you do something and it generates, let's say on the whiteboard, some information. In the old days, you just generate it on the whiteboard and your face-to-face class then erase it. And you know, they took a picture with their phone, or they wrote it down, or they didn't, and that's on them. But in this new modality, you have to be more careful about tracking all of the things that come through your course and making those available to all of the people in all of the modalities. This is something I've only gotten used to in the last year since I've been working in the co-lab, because we really have this principle in our head that when we do something, we want it to be available and shareable and open and accessible to as many people as possible. So now it's kind of second nature to me, but when I taught in face-to-face classes, that was not the way I taught normally. I didn't think about keeping things for sharing in future contexts. And finally, accessibility. Look at how each student is accessing every tiny shred of your class and paying attention to those accessibility channels. So that's everything from accessibility like ADA stuff, right? So if this student is going to be watching a recording later, do they need captions? What kinds of things do I have to be doing to make sure that I'm accommodating my students across every modality, not just one anymore? So those are the values of HyFlex, and there's some slides here that you can review more on your own after that break down each of these across HyFlex design. So we have some for learner choice, some for equivalency, reusability. Again, we're going to share this out to you, and accessibility. So I want to talk a little bit about some folks who just jumped into HyFlex in the spring during COVID-19, which is not what most of us at Plymouth did, right? We were totally face-to-face, and then about 40 hours later, we were totally online, right? So some people did more HyFlex arrangements. And actually at Plymouth, we did this a tiny bit. I heard about folks like Mike's son, for example, I think was one, who kind of just went into their labs and taught their bio classes in their same environments. So in some ways, they were there face-to-face while most of their students were online. These little tiny studies that have been done of HyFlex are actually kind of interesting to me, even though I would not use them to extrapolate because they're too small. So they're more anecdotal. But at University of Nebraska, I thought it was really interesting that when they rolled out HyFlex, the students all said at the beginning that they absolutely preferred face-to-face learning. And that's what we hear at Plymouth. I don't know about you in advising, but I absolutely heard from my students. I prefer face-to-face. I might not come back to Plymouth if we're online. So our students, many of our students like face-to-face, and this study showed that students say that they prefer face-to-face. But what they found during this COVID semester was that even though most students thought they would not select the asynchronous online modality, many more students ended up selecting that than they had planned. So that suggests perhaps that during times of stress and emergency, the HyFlex option becomes more attractive to students. And even if some of us don't feel like we're in an emergency in the fall because we're a little bit more planned and slightly less anxious, I won't be less anxious, but you might be less anxious in the fall. Many of our students are still going to be living in these same emergency situations that Rochelle just described, for example. So HyFlex might be a good option. What's interesting is at the end of that semester, the majority said that they would absolutely prefer to always, every semester for the rest of their lives, have HyFlex as an option because they appreciated the flexibility that it gave them to stay engaged even when things were challenging. I'm not going to tell this to anybody in the USNH administration, but 22% of students said they'd even pay more money for a HyFlex option. The reason that's interesting is that many students have been asking for a reduction in tuition for online remote learning, but students actually expressed they would pay more for HyFlex. This suggests that they thought the modality was valuable to them, unlike the pure online learning modalities that they seem to think have less value to them. Ohio State also did a larger HyFlex study where they found no difference in their learning outcomes and performance metrics between those who attended online and those who attended in class. I find that kind of useless because I think it probably just depends on how well you do this, right? So like if you do a crappy job with the online portions, for example, you're gonna see not good results. So that's maybe more about the teaching than anything else. But here are a couple slides that I thought were interesting that came from a pre-COVID HyFlex webinar. Why would you use HyFlex? Well, if you look at those bullet points, I think it does suggest perhaps the next bullet point might be global pandemic, right? These are the kinds of reasons that people turn to HyFlex. But I also want to point out things like weather events and sporting events. Sporting events means, like, you know, if you're playing on the soccer team and you have an away game, you would normally miss that class and we would excuse you for it, but you'd probably fall behind. So some people are also interested in HyFlex because it could be used in kind of sporadic ways once COVID is over, that might help you keep more of your students engaged if, for example, they have an illness, or there is an event, or we miss some days for snow. Faculty in this particular study, and you'll get all the links to these in the slides, were pretty happy with HyFlex design and felt that it had a positive effect on student engagement. I'm not really trying to sell this to you. I'm just saying, if you end up thinking this is useful and you use some of it, it looks pedagogically sort of promising compared to some other models that we might use. So the more I learned about it, the more interested I got in trying to think about this long term. Faculty did find that because students were choosing their modality, they felt like they had more buy-in to the course. So some of the comments reflected that that learner agency seemed to have a positive impact on student performance and outcomes. And the student comments from one of these studies also showed that it impacted their sense of how much their professors cared about them. They felt that because their professors understood the challenges that they were facing, that meant that they felt more supported, and that was a nice benefit, particularly helpful perhaps during the pandemic. There was also one other study that showed some interesting things happening, and I just throw this out for post-COVID dreaming. What they found is that students who were in a very big HyFlex course, so for example, I don't know what our biggest classes are here because we don't have that many, but if you taught a lecture course that was more in the 100 student range, what they found is that when that was offered HyFlex, some students actually started rolling out small cohorts to watch the recorded lectures together in groups of, say, 4 or 5 in their dorms. So it made me think, wow, you could actually organize some of these so that there would be residential cohorts who would watch in a dorm. There would be sports cohorts so that different teams could experience their parts of the course together. We could roll this out in ways that integrate the academic side of the house with the student life side of the house more effectively if we thought about HyFlex and how we could build community. So they said it actually built community in a way that they had not predicted. These are not great for social distancing times, but they could be interesting after social distancing times. We're going to offer you some HyFlex design worksheets, but one simple way of thinking about designing your course for HyFlex is to think about on the left, I think it's your left, yeah, my left, the left side of the screen, there are content, activities, communication, and support. Because you don't just have to design your content, right? You already understand that, yeah, my content has to be delivered online and face-to-face. But it's all the other things as well have to be delivered that way. So for example, this worksheet goes with activities where you might have group work in your class. Everybody split into groups of 4 and we're gonna go through these 4 questions. Now you have to translate that activity to an online-based activity. The same thing with communication, where you might tell your students something in a class. How's that communication going to be organized for your online students? And also support. You may offer certain kinds of support face-to-face and different kinds of support online. So if you break your course into content, activities, communication, and support, and then think about creating grids for the in-class students and the out-of-class students, you're starting to get a bit of a handle on how you have to approach the design around HyFlex, right? You can't just think about a lesson, because a lesson includes content, activities, communication, and support. So organizing that in some way can be really helpful. A way of thinking about it is if you come up with what your outcome or objective is, you want to think about how that translates to the in-class, to the synchronous, and to the async. Now, synchronous online and in class are not the same group. So let's say you're in a Zoom room and you've got 6 students in the class, and you're teaching face-to-face with them, and you're recording that, but some people are live Zooming in, so they're synchronous. If you do group work with those 6 students in the class, are the people who are live watching you just going to watch them do group work? Or are they going to go into a Zoom breakout room? And then what are those async students going to do, right? So they're all actually different from each other, which is challenging. So one thing I would suggest, because already I can see Paul Rogalis shaking his head, no way. And actually he's not, but I'm just imagining that anybody thoughtful would be thinking this just sounds Herculean. And if I were going to really do HyFlex, I would probably do 1 course a year. That's like what I think would be about right. So maybe what we do is we don't think about doing this beautifully for every course for fall, but we just think about maybe 1 course that would work well even after COVID in a sort of HyFlex model and giving that a try. Maybe there's certain classes where you teach certain things that could be moved to HyFlex, or certain, say, 3 or 4 week modules that could be created in a HyFlex model. Maybe a certain assignment, or even a kind of test or assessment. I just noticed a bear ate all my trash last night. Phil. Oh well. It's a beautiful view of the mountains and a big trash pile in my yard. But the idea here is that we don't necessarily have the time to do everything all HyFlex all the time. So think about how you teach and what pieces might make HyFlex work for you that you could tackle in a really quality kind of way. I want you to think about some of the challenges inherent in HyFlex. This is a recording of King Lear being performed. Some of you, even recently, I've been watching the National Theater productions that they've been streaming live. They did Frankenstein last week. And so it's really interesting when you record plays, because sometimes you record them like this, where there's just a camera and it's like you've got a seat in the audience, right? And you're just watching the whole thing. I don't know if anybody's ever watched a play recorded like this, but it's not that great, right? It's kind of like, after a while, you're sort of like, oh God. You can imagine that when you record your Zoom classroom, it's cool like this because they'll see the questions that your students ask in the class, and they'll be just like those students who are there. But on the other hand, look at that, it's not super appealing, right? You don't necessarily want to watch that. Whereas this is a production of King Lear, live theater, but it's staged for the camera. So there's no audience and the camera moves in and out, and it's much more palatable to watch. But what that means is that you're not gonna get the live audience feedback. So here you are trying to decide, I wanna quote unquote Zoom my lecture. Which kind of Zooming are you doing? Are you recording your class as you teach it? Are you doing something that's more expressive with better slide view for your online students? You really have to think about which modality you want to work in.
Pardon me, darling, if I may for a moment interrupt. I'm trying to wrap my mind around this, and it seems better to me, perhaps, to prep for a fully online class, or to prep for a fully offline class, but not both at the same time. For instance, I have a scenario in my mind of what if I had planned for one day to be doing group work, and no one shows up. Everyone is looking at their computers. What should I do?
Well, Professor X, you are annoying, but it is a good point. So one of the other challenges with HyFlex is that because students are exercising their choice, you plan a really wonderful face-to-face class and some really wonderful online classes, and you show up face-to-face and nobody's there. but your synchronous online students are depending on whatever you had planned there in the class, is very challenging, right? So the reason I say this is not to dissuade you from doing it. Like I said, I'm pretty stoked on HyFlex. I think there's a lot of good ideas here that we can mine, but I just want you to run the scenarios in your head, and not think of this as, I think if anybody asks you to just like when I saw that in WMUR, right? And it's just a single sentence that says, oh, and by the way, if you want to be online while everybody else is face-to-face, that's fine. Well, thanks, Chancellor Leach. It is fine, but it's a hella big design challenge, right, to figure out how to do this. So start small and think deep about what could happen to you as you move into these modalities. But to me, there's some really exciting possibilities for students who are going to have very big challenges with health, with being in person. Even if we start the semester online, if we have a small outbreak, we'll probably close. How can we be ready to adjust for these different scenarios? HyFlex could give us a good option for some of that. Here are some of the questions that I might leave you from. Not just how HyFlex could benefit your courses this fall, but could you use this? One of the things we're really interested in interdisciplinary studies is we have a senior seminar at the end, which is pretty project-based and capstone-y. And lots of our students are older, and a lot of them are just finishing up maybe half a semester's worth of credits, and they've got that capstone. If we offer that HyFlex, students may be able to go and get jobs and start working and come into that class a little bit more easily. Are there parts of your program after COVID that if you offered some HyFlex alternatives, we could still retain some of that face-to-face connection that we're famous for at Plymouth, but give some more flexibility to students as they finish? We have had students in interdisciplinary studies who were fighting cancer, and we used HyFlex without knowing it was HyFlex at the time, right? Are there ways that this might benefit you or your program later? Do we have to do it all or nothing? Could you offer a HyFlex module, for example, at the end of your semester or in the middle of your semester? Could it be used strategically with certain modules or certain classes that you teach? If you want to do this, what do you need to try and learn before you start designing your class? Think about that for tomorrow when we have this slate of workshops, and think about it on Thursday and Friday when the CoLab staff and all the folks who are participating in Slipper Days will be in the CoLab virtual office from 8:30 to 5, Thursday and Friday, specifically to give you some tips if you know you need to learn certain things. We can say, okay, you want to learn that? Here's where you're going to go. Here are the resources we're going to give you. What barriers do we need to address both in your class and systemically, right, if we're going to do this, particularly in terms of technology access. And finally, as you think about cluster learning, interdisciplinarity, project-based learning, and open education, how can HyFlex complement this? Couple quick examples. Let's say you and a colleague on a regular non-COVID semester both build one HyFlex module into the center of your courses. Perhaps your courses meet up just for that 2-week module and do something together. That's been pretty hard to do in face-to-face courses because we have to deal with the room assignments and the crossover in times. But with HyFlex, you might be able to do more of those collaborations without necessarily pre-planning all of the rigmarole around the face-to-face participation. Also with open education, if you make your course HyFlex and people can come in and join it, you could actually open that course up to people from outside the course. So you could offer a 1-week HyFlex module where the public is allowed to participate. That could be great for project-based courses, for community building, for engaging with experts in your field. So HyFlex has lots to offer, I think, to cluster learning. And I would suggest that any work you do this summer, you think a little bit about work that will help us in the long term, not just, for the next 8 months or so. So with that, I'm going to see if we have any, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to see if we have any specific questions about that. I see the chat is overloaded, so there's no way I'm going to be able to look in there. But is there anything we want to tackle now before we talk about modular learning, Hannah?
So I've been capturing quite a few of the stuff that's been coming through on the chat. Having a hard time keeping up, so bear with me here. But we are definitely having a lot of conversations about the flexibility and the scheduling of this. And we have a good question that came through. Is it contrary to the spirit of HyFlex to ask students to tell us ahead of time how they plan to attend on some particular day? Like when we have a group activity we've been building up to, if you say you'll be online and you don't show up to class and vice versa. So is that in the spirit of HyFlex?
That is a super awesome question. And because I'm not the keeper of the spirit of HyFlex, I don't think I can answer it except to say, I think the spirit is to leave as much choice and agency with the students, but that's within the context of how your course is running. So I would say it would definitely be not in the spirit of HyFlex to make people sign up on day one to experience the course in a steady way all the way through. And there are course designs like that, especially with certain MOOCs, right, where you have to say, I'm going to do this. And so you probably wouldn't want to do that, but it seems perfectly reasonable to me that if you had a face-to-face activity, you could say, hey, on Thursday, this synchronous activity depends on 5 people being in class. Can I get 5 volunteers to commit to being there so we can run this? And then they might say, no, we can't. And you say, okay, let's maybe change up Thursday's plan then. So I would just say maybe have a conversation with your students. But the cool thing about this is you don't even have to tell anybody you're doing HyFlex. Like, you can just do what you want that works for you and your students. One of the things we definitely saw in the feedback that you gave us about remote learning was that I was so shocked because I didn't even want to ask y'all what went well, because I thought it was like an offensive question, because you'd be like, screw you, nothing, But in the column about what went well, lots of people said, talking with my students went well, like listening to them, hearing from them, working with them on what they needed. We did a great job. So I would say keeping that in mind seems like it was effective, and doing that with HyFlex would probably work for you. Let me just take one more if there is, and then we're gonna have lots of time at the end. I just know some people probably don't, I'm gonna stay here all day and night and tomorrow.
Sorry, I'm just trying to pick from all of the ones that I have. So definitely some logistical questions about this, especially with students being prepared for HyFlex and knowing going into a class if it's going to be HyFlex. Is there a way for students to be informed of this, especially because it could help with enrollment in courses? So we're definitely wondering about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we don't have a HyFlex designation yet, right? We have hybrid. So like Matt Cheney has already decided before, this, that he is going to make one of his classes HyFlex in the fall, regardless of, what happens with our university's decisions. So he put that under a hybrid designation, which we felt was the closest that we had for the registrar designation. And then he's going to explain that, what HyFlex is, to the students, and what their HyFlex is, right? Because it could be a little bit different. Yeah, Matt Cheney couldn't be with us today, but Professor X could relay comments.
Robin,
but I do want to say one last thing about that, which is that, we can look into HyFlex designation, even potentially for fall, but we may also be forced into HyFlex because, the system may just say, we're going back to school, it's face-to-face. If you don't want to come, you can be online, which, surprise, now your class is HyFlex, right? So there's maybe lots of ways that could happen. Hannah, go ahead.
I want to be mindful of time, but I really want to bring up this one brought up by Howard Frederick about guarding the health and safety of our faculty as well. Just because this HyFlex also offers a face-to-face opportunity, and how do we protect kind of vulnerable faculty in kind of a HyFlex model?
Well, this is my secret idea. Don't tell anybody, but my secret idea is that we roll out HyFlex and the faculty member also gets to choose to be online. I don't really know. So first of all, I actually think that would completely work depending on how and what you teach. There would be reasons why students could be in a room and you could be virtual. Like, I don't actually see any problem with that. What I will say is that the question about faculty health is above the sort of pay grade of the collab at this point. But I think we absolutely have to have that conversation as an institution. And I assume when we find out what the contingency plans are, if it's not that we're all fully remote, there's going to be conversations about how to keep our campus safe. And I just can't tell you what that would be. So I won't even pretend to answer that, except that maybe you do want to be thinking about, could you run a HyFlex class from your house? Because I know that gets edgy and interesting, but I find that pretty interesting. I see lots of people talking about it in the chat, so keep it up. And all those kinds of questions we need to get answered. They're just not questions for us necessarily.